you look at the patterns, they do tend to happen very often on these kind of cycles. Things go wrong. So 7 years is actually a fairly typical period of stability, which is followed by crisis. So I think it's pointing at the real world.
The solution was predicated on finding an overseer or an administrator who had understanding and wisdom. And the wisdom would be a traditional wisdom based on an understanding of man's role on the earth.
But when you're ambitious and you really want to get, make your way in the world, the whole Lamborghini culture, the whole, holiday home yacht culture or whatever, it's tempting, isn't it? Let's be honest. This, even though being a trustee is, I think, morally better, it doesn't feel as much of fun in our modern society, does it?
The Manna Journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
This is an episode of the Manna Journey created by Phillip Ullmann. The Manna Journey is a whole new concept in economics, in business and in governance, where we take the wisdom of the Bible to create innovation in business and indeed then push that through to a change in our society through good governance. Today, I'm going to be talking to Phillip himself and, of course, a great businessman and a friend of ours, I think, Suhail Mirza. So, Suhail, you've been an incredibly successful businessman. You still are. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and why you came to believing that faith-based initiatives are a good thing?
Faith-based initiatives have been an important part of my own upbringing in my own faith, but I was delighted and honoured to be invited along to speak with Phillip, who I've known and admired for a long, long time. I've known his business acumen in the recruitment sector for decades. My own background is I'm a lawyer by training, as an employment lawyer in the city, and over the last 20 years have been focused in the healthcare sector, owning a business providing care for the sector, writing for the sector. I was a city editor at Recruitment International, and I sit on boards for businesses that provide healthcare and healthcare staff.
And given that you are an employment lawyer and you employ people, you must be worried about the way that employment's gone in recent years.
Well, I think there's a role for the protecting of employees. If you're a good employer, that shouldn't frighten you at all. If you're not, then it will, of course, be a challenge. But there's always that risk element. But I think if you have a good culture and have a worldview which is supportive of people, that isn't problematic. One of the other areas that I'm very interested in and spend my time doing is as a speaker globally and in the UK, supporting the NHS and healthcare workforce in wellness and well-being, spiritual well-being.
How important is the Quran and Islamic teachings in your business, and does it make your businesses different from perhaps others?
No, I think those are the principles that I bring to the work that I do. Whether if I'm working with investors or I sit on a board, I'd like to take those principles of fairness, equity, and regarding everybody as a mirror of me. If we're made in the image of one creator, which is the Bible says this, the Torah says this, and the Quran says exactly the same. So when I come to a transaction, there's a third party present, and that may sound quaint, but that's how I believe that both parties to a transaction can win.
So what I'd like to do today, is to consider a story that I've known about for many years. I studied it when I was young, that I've looked at again in the last 3 years. And I've seen it in a completely new light. I concentrated on what the words actually mean, and there are significant insights which are relevant to the world in which we're living. And I'd like to start with actually reading the text, and let's take it from there. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 41, verse 28. And in context, Pharaoh's had 2 dreams, and Joseph is about to interpret those dreams. So verse 28, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years are coming when there will be great abundance throughout the land of Egypt. Notice the land of Egypt is what's referred to here. But after them will come 7 years of famine, when all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten. So again, Egypt is the subject of that sentence. famine will ravage the land. Now we have a change of subject. It's in the Hebrew, it's haaretz, it's the land, which I don't think is actually the way I translate it. To me, I think actually means the world, not the land. So devastating will be the famine that no one in the world will know anything of abundance anymore. So what we have is a dream actually forecasting a global crisis. I think it's probably the first global crisis we've had in history. That's why it's particularly relevant, I think, to the world in which we live in. And Joseph is having to come up with a strategy to deal with the fact that in the land of Egypt, there's going to be abundance, 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of moderate famine. Whereas in the rest of the world, there's 7 years of normal crop with 7 years of devastating famine afterwards. So a global crisis, a famine throughout the world, and a potential of abundance and resources in one land.
It strikes me as an analogy with our current banking crisis that's actually come every few years and affect people on a profound level.
Yeah.
One of the questions I was going to ask you, is the suggestion that the activities of the Egyptians precipitates a global crisis? Is that the interrelationship?
I think it's just telling a story of what happens as Suhail says, we live with this. I mean, there are always crises. And 7 years is not actually untypical. If you look at the patterns, they do tend to happen very often on these kind of cycles. Things go wrong. So 7 years is actually a fairly typical period of stability, which is followed by crisis. So I think it's pointing at the real world. And so what we have is a global crisis. And the only person that can resolve it is Pharaoh, because he's got the abundance in Egypt. So let's see what the solution that Joseph recommends. So this is verse 33. So now let Pharaoh seek an astute, wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint overseers. And that's the key word. The Hebrew is pekidim, overseers, which is in my world, trustees, which is, I think, a concept that we should discuss. So what he's saying is Joseph is suggesting that Pharaoh appoint trustees across the land. Again, the word is haaretz. So in a trust, you have people who have control over assets, but the people they're looking after those assets for are not just themselves and their family. It's for, in this case, what's translated as the land, but I think it's the world. So what he's coming up with, I think, is a beautiful solution involving trustees appointed in each city. He goes on to explain that. So the trustees are appointed with the beneficiary of the trust being the world. And that the Pharaoh appoint the trustees across the world and take a fifth of Egypt's harvest during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the food in his coming good years, storing the grain under the Pharaoh's aegis. So there's definitely a role for the state, Pharaoh being a state. So there is a role for the state. So that there is food under the guard in all the cities. But that's saying that this is a distributed solution, i.e. trustees with the beneficiary being the world, but storing the stuff locally in the local community.
Ensuring that there's a system in place, ensuring that there are people who can be trustees is a vital element of it, and also some element of financial support. But actually, it's more the governance that they're concerned about within this, isn't there?
It's a corporation, which is the key here. And if you step back a bit further, the idea that having surpluses, or indeed the whole of the production as a trust on behalf of something which is greater, which of course will be the Lord, if we take the Genesis term.
But the problem we've had is this casino capitalism, where really nobody is taking responsibility for anything other than the me element of it, Philip.
Absolutely right. And that's, I think, what Joseph is addressing. He's saying, no, the me culture results in the opposite. And let me actually tell you what actually happens, because Joseph's advice is beautiful. Trusteeship, 1, trusteeship, 2, with the world being the beneficiary of the trust ultimately. That's not to say you don't care about your local people and family, but it's concentric circles. And then you store the stuff at city level under the aegis, under the auspices. So those are the components. But if we look at what actually happens in the story, that's not what actually happens. And I think that will tie into the world that we live in. So we now need to go to Genesis 47, where we see what actually happens. And so what it says, and this is Genesis 47, verse 14, Joseph collected all the money that was found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain that people were buying. So in his original solution, so there was no money changing hands.
Yeah.
Because it was a food crisis, wasn't it? People need food to live. And money, I think we must recognize, is necessary as a means of exchange, but it's not the end, which is sometimes where we get confused. But he's saying, no, his initial plan is only for food to be distributed. And he suggests these trustees. But what eventually happens is that if you look at what Pharaoh does, he doesn't appoint the trustees.
It's an abuse of monopoly power.
Exactly.
It's exactly that. It's painting a picture of what happens if you take the wisdom of Joseph, but you then take out the trusteeship, which means it's about the eye. And the first thing that happens is all the money is collected, and he brought it into Pharaoh's palace. So the king, the shareholder, or the capitalist, or the worldwide owner of a company gets everything. When the money in Egypt and Canaan was gone, all the Egyptians came to Joseph saying, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes just because there's no more money left? Bring your livestock," said Joseph. So the second stage is, okay, first thing that goes is the money.
Yep.
And which, of course, money is the means of exchange, as it is in our world. And then once that's gone, they actually get all the animals. Of course, in a growing economy, animals are important. They produce milk and materials, and of course, in a non-vegetarian society, they provide food as well. So that's the second thing that goes is the livestock. So and the third stage in Genesis, same chapter, verse 20. Thus Joseph acquired all the lands for Egypt. So in stage 3, after the money is gone and the animals have gone, the land is acquired.
It feels a little bit like repossession, doesn't it? The kind of you've not succeeded because the system's rigged against you, and then you lose your own property as a result of it. Exactly what happens.
And the philosophical basis of it has changed. If you go back to what Phillip read there, the solution was predicated on finding an overseer or an administrator who had understanding and wisdom. They were the predicates, and the wisdom would be a traditional wisdom based on an understanding of man's role on the earth. When you take that out, that ethical principle out, then you can have.
But this is the problem that we've suffered from so many times, and certainly I look back at the 2008 banking crisis, financial crisis, and you just feel like people aren't trustees. They're going in there with their own ambitions, their own aims, and their own selfishness. I mean, I look around the number of people who walked off with 6-bedroom houses in the home counties, having lost banks an absolute fortune, and then in the end, and I don't want to be funny about this, it's nurses that don't get a pay rise because we can't afford to pay them.
And then the climax is in verse 25 of the same chapter. "You have saved our lives," they said. "May we find favor in the eyes of my Lord. We shall be slaves to Pharaoh." So they're at the point, they're on their knees. They actually want to become slaves, which is very relevant. They actually ask to become slaves. When you're in that kind of mindset where you've lost everything, you've lost your money, your animals, your land, you lack dignity.
Yeah.
And then they actually say, "Make us slaves." So I think the picture that's being painted, as Suhail said, is if you don't get the model right, if you don't get trusteeship right, if you don't get the distribution responsibility to local cities with overseers, you end up with the world that we're living in, I think, which is where people, the money gets centralized, where all the money goes to the shareholders, to big wealthy 100 billion, 200 billion.
It gets concentrated. I think we have a concentration of power and influence and a reversal, almost a regressive reversal of equitable principles. And I think there you've seen what happens, that slave mentality, use that word, you alluded to the mental faculties. We have a mental health crisis globally, which has not been helped by the global financial crisis that you alluded to. I think the World Health Organization and Reuters estimate $16 trillion is going to be the cost of the mental health crisis over the next 10 years. And an element of that is financial well-being. If you are enslaved to your job and role, etc., as Phillip alluded to from that beautiful story, that makes it very hard for you to be autonomous and have agency.
But you almost said the word accountability, which I think is really, really important, because the thing is, even with the best will in the world, if it's just about you on your own, in isolation, you are never going to serve the world or serve your community in the way if there's multiple overseers, multiple trustees who all have expertise, all working together. That is inevitably just going to be a better system, isn't it?
It's almost the first example of insider trading. So Joseph is given the inside information, which he wants to use for the right purpose. Pharaoh says, no, it's mine, because it was my dream, effectively, and I'm going to use it to line my own pockets, and everyone else becomes a slave.
Sorry, Suhail, I was just going to say, I mean, you've spent loads and loads of time in business. What do you recognise in modern business practices from what Philip's just read out?
Well, I think the principles we've talked about, the idea that that profit-seeking, adding value, production, we all support that idea. But that has to be not in a vacuum. It has to be in a basis of principles where your accountability is beyond not just your narrow stakeholders or shareholders, but a broader impact on the community and actually the wider societies. In Philip's interpretation of the land talked about the impact globally, and sometimes you need to have collaboration and cooperation which transcends those barriers.
But it can't be easy. I mean, Philip's a hugely successful businessman, as are you. I'm not. I'm a TV presenter who works at the House of Commons. But, you know, when you're ambitious and you really want to get, make your way in the world, the whole Lamborghini culture, the whole, holiday home yacht culture or whatever, it's tempting, isn't it? Let's be honest. This, even though being a trustee is, I think, morally better, it doesn't feel as much fun in our modern society, does it?
If you take a purely individualistic approach, then yes, that makes sense, because the modern world is a homo economicus, is the term, where we have to utilitarian, and we have to be profit-seeking and individual maximising of utility. Yeah. That's changing now. I think that there's many academics, Mariana Mazzucato is a professor at UCL, talking about the idea that actually the state has a role in garnering entrepreneurialism and protecting the common good. Yes. I think we are beginning to see thinkers that are challenging, not reversing capitalism, but challenging the way that it's now unbridled.
But there was always
absolutely, the key is neither Suhail or myself are talking about not having a system of ownership. In Islam and Judaism, there is ownership, but the key concept is what Joseph is talking about, is you recognise that you are a trustee, and therefore you use the resources to look after your family and the community and the nation. But in the case of a global crisis, you have to make sure that you use resources appropriately. So we're not saying that everybody's the same. I think neither Islam or Christianity or Judaism is saying that. But the key is to recognise it's not yours alone. You are the controller, but it's for the benefits of society at large.
Look, people often get very blinkered about these things, don't they? I mean, how many times, and it's just a really simple example, how many times have you had lots and lots and lots of junk mail put through your door, which is profitable for the junk mail people, but of course it costs a fortune in recycling and going to landfill and whatever. And so there's a wider cost associated with this that isn't reflected in the bottom line of the junk mail factory.